So you've just turned 60, you've built up £500,000 in a pension pot, and now you're wondering, how do I actually access this? How do I get income from it? Now, this is one of the most common questions I'm asked. And to be honest, it's probably one of the most misunderstood areas of retirement and pension planning. So in this video, I'm going to explain to you what an annuity is versus what drawdown is. I'm going to go through the pros and cons of each and actually show you how to decide which option is best for you. But if you're new here, my name's Ben, I'm a chartered financial planner, and my aim is to help as many people as possible gain more clarity and confidence around their personal finances and their retirement plan. Okay, so let's start with the basics. What is an annuity? Now, effectively what an annuity is you go to an insurance provider and say, I've got a pension pot of £500,000, and they'll say, okay, well, if you give us that, we'll promise to pay you a set amount each year for the remainder of your life. Now, the important thing when it comes to annuities is that these are guaranteed. So no matter how long you live for, you know that you're going to get that same level of income year in, year out for the rest of your life. You're not taking any investment risk. Now, clearly the trade-off to this is once you've bought that annuity, that £500,000 has gone. You will never be able to access that again. So really, when it comes to annuities, the type of people this is likely to suit best are people that value guarantee, people that are probably likely to live quite a long time, people that don't want any level of investment risk, and if you don't care about leaving an inheritance. Now, the annuity rate you get can vary depending on a multitude of factors, but the most common variables are whether it's single life or joint life. So simply what this means is that if it's single life, when you die, your spouse will get none of that income. Whereas if it's joint life, your spouse is likely to continue to get maybe 50% or 2/3 of the annuity that you were getting. Another big variable is whether that increases in line with inflation. And this is called indexation. So again, this is the one that actually has the biggest impact on the rate you get. And the final variable is if there are any guarantees. Now, simply what this means is that there might be a 5-year guarantee, for example. So that effectively means if you die within the first 5 years of purchasing that annuity, your spouse or beneficiaries may get some or all of the lump sum back that you paid for the annuity. And I put on screen now the current annuity rates typically you would get. So you can see here that there are varying levels of rates depending on kind of the types of benefits you want, whether that's single life or joint life, whether you want that increasing or level, and if there are any guarantees built into that. Okay, so how about drawdown? So with drawdown, effectively your pension pot remains invested once you reach retirement. So you've still got that same £500,000 that you can access. Now, one of the big benefits of drawdown is that you can choose how much you want to take each year. Now, if you've seen any of my previous videos, you'll know that typically as financial planners, we see that people spend more in the early years of retirement than they do in the later years, simply because they're in better health to do things like holidays and more travel. So having a drawdown pot rather than buying an annuity means you can take more in the earlier years and less in the later years. Now, clearly the trade-off to this is the fact that you are keeping that money invested. So you are taking investment risk with that money. Now, what this means is that clearly you are going to be susceptible to market crashes. So you're going to see the value of that pension go up and down. And the other key thing is that if you draw too much from that pension pot could actually run out before you die. Meaning you would be reliant on your other income. So for example, for some people that might just be their state pension if you got to a point where your drawdown pot were to be depleted. So the type of people that drawdown may be better suited to are people that are quite happy with a level of investment risk. They're perhaps looking to pass money on to their spouse or their kids or beneficiaries when they die. They may want more flexibility in terms of when and how they can access their pension. And perhaps if they've got other guaranteed income, such as a final salary pension, which they can rely upon if their pension pot in drawdown does run out. Okay, so now we've looked at what an annuity is and what drawdown is. Let's now look at a real life example and the impact this can actually have on your retirement plan. So what I've done here is I've modelled someone that's age 60 with £500,000 in their pension. Now, in the first scenario, I've assumed they've bought an annuity. So what I've done is I've assumed they've used 75% of that to purchase an annuity and the other 25% as tax-free cash. Now, for the purposes of the scenario, I've assumed that tax-free cash amount of £125,000 remains invested. And then the £375,000 goes to the insurance provider to provide them with an annuity. Now, based on current rates, I've assumed that that annuity is going to be about £17,000 a year. Now, in terms of the drawdown pot, I've assumed this remains invested. So I've assumed this is invested in a balanced portfolio. So about 60% equities and 40% bonds. Now in both scenarios, I've assumed a level of spending of £30,000 a year, inflation adjusted, from now until age 75. And then once the individual reaches age 75, I've assumed the spending is reduced by about 25%. So that's about £22,500 a year from age 75 to age 90. Now it's probably important to mention at this point that I have not included the state pension in any of this. And that's simply to make the calculations a bit easier. But clearly, if you have got a state pension, which most people will do, then the amount you can spend is going to be higher. Okay, so let's first look at the situation where you purchase an annuity. Now, you can see here that this has an 84% chance of success. So what we're saying here is if you're retired at any point over the last 100 years, in 84 of those 100 years, you'd have had sufficient income to actually meet those expenses of £30,000 a year for the first 15 years of retirement and £22,500 a year for the later 15 years of retirement. Now, one of the key things I really want you to take away from all of this is the sustainable spending. So simply what this means is that based on historical market data, what is the minimum and the maximum that you could have spent during your retirement? So you can see that if you've retired at the worst point and purchased an annuity, and then use that tax-free cash to actually supplement your income, you can see that the maximum sustainable spend would have been about £26,000 a year. Now conversely, if you retired at the very best point, you would have been able to spend about £34,000 a year. Now the reason for this is because depending on where you retire can have a huge impact on how much you can actually withdraw. But the thing I really want you to compare here is the range. So you can see here that in a situation where you're buying an annuity, the range between the worst case scenario and the best case scenario is about £8,000 a year. So clearly it's not insignificant. But when we go on to show you the drawdown and the range there, you'll see how powerful buying an annuity can actually be if you do value that certainty and less risk. Okay, so moving on to the situation where you go into drawdown. So no annuity purchase, things continue as is, and you draw out £30,000 a year from your drawdown pot. Now, you can see here that the chance of success based on historical market data is actually higher than it is with the annuity, and it's about 92%. So again, 92 out of the last 100 years, this would have been sustainable. 8 out of those 100 years, it wouldn't have been. Okay, and now here's the interesting part, going back to sustainable spending that I mentioned before. So on screen now, I've put the range between the minimum spending and the maximum spending. And again, minimum is if you're retired at the very worst point over the last 100 years, and maximum is if you're retired at the very best point. Now you can see here the minimum spend, so if you're retired at the very worst point over the last 100 years, is about £22,000 a year. Now, if you go back to the annuity example, that minimum was £26,000. So you can see here that because you are less exposed when you purchase an annuity to investment risk, if you did retire at a particularly bad point, you know that you're probably likely to spend actually a bit more than if you had actually left your money in drawdown. Now conversely, let's look at the best case scenario. So what we're saying here is if you retired at the most optimal point over the last 100 years and stayed in drawdown, you could have spent £50,000 a year. Now, again, going back to the annuity example, even in the best case scenario, your maximum spend was £34,000 a year. So by being in drawdown, the best case scenario, you're actually being able to spend about £16,000 a year more. That's about a 50% increase. So as I say, the key takeaway really is the range here. So if you buy an annuity, the range is between £26,000 and £34,000. Whereas if you keep your money in drawdown, that range is £22,000 to £50,000. So this really shows you how big of a choice it is whether you purchase an annuity or go into drawdown, because it can have a massive impact on the range of spending depending on when you retire. Okay, so based on what I've discussed so far, you might be thinking this is a binary choice. It's black or white. It's drawdown or annuity. When in reality, that is just not the case. And quite often we see people take a hybrid approach. So as an example, what you might do is you might say, I want my essential expenses to be covered and guaranteed. So let's say, for example, your essential expenses are £1,000 a month. You might say, I want to purchase an annuity for £12,000 a year. So I know I've got that peace of mind that regardless of what happens with markets, I know that my essential expenses are covered. You can then use the drawdown pot to fund your discretionary expenses. So what that might look like is if markets have a particularly bad run, you may spend a bit less in terms of discretionary expenses. Whereas if they actually perform quite well, you might actually be able to spend more in that particular year. And the other thing to mention at this point is that if you do decide to go down the drawdown route, you still can choose an annuity at a later date. So again, something that we can see quite often is that people value that flexibility for the early years of retirement. So let's say from 60 to 75, they might say, I'm going to keep all my money in drawdown because I really want that flexibility to draw as much or as little as I need to. Then when I get to 75, 80, when I'm probably spending a bit less and I don't really need that flexibility and perhaps I value the guarantee a bit more, I'll purchase an annuity at that point. So again, this is a really good option that you might want to look at if having that flexibility in the early years of retirement is important to you. So next thing you might be thinking is, okay, well, how much do I actually need to retire? So what I would suggest you do is check out my retirement calculator. And this is free, there's no catch and there's no email required for the sign up. And you can find a link to this in the description below. And simply what this allows you to do is input your own details. It'll probably take you about a minute because it only asks about 6 questions. What it does is it will show you if you are on track to actually retire when you want to with the income you want. Anyway, hope you've enjoyed the video. Hope you've got some value from it, and I'll see you in the next one.